It is Sunday, December 7th, 1941, on the calm, palm-lined shores of Oahu, where the Pacific sun usually bathes the island in peace. The skies suddenly darken with the roar of engines. A swarm of Japanese warplanes descends upon Pearl Harbor, the beating heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In mere minutes, tranquility is replaced by fire and chaos. Explosions tear through the battleships anchored in the harbor. Plumes of black smoke rise skyward, and the sound of steel twisting under relentless bombardment signals the dawn of a new and catastrophic chapter in history. This was not just an attack. It was a calculated gamble designed to cripple America's ability to project power across the Pacific. Far across the ocean, in Hiroshima Bay, the mastermind of this operation awaits news with cold anticipation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, knows that the success or failure of this strike will determine the fate of his nation. For him, Pearl Harbor is more than a battle plan. It is an audacious attempt to buy Japan time, to seize control of the Pacific before the industrial might of the United States awakens. Yamamoto is a man torn by duty and foresight, a strategist who privately doubts Japan's long-term prospects, but nonetheless designs one of the most daring naval offensives in history. He embodies the paradox of a leader who simultaneously fears the war he helps ignite. But who was this admiral, this reluctant architect of infamy? To understand Yamamoto's place in history, we must go back decades earlier to his childhood in the provincial town of Nagaoka, Niigata Prefecture. Born Isoroku Takano on April 4, 1884, he was the youngest son of a samurai family, struggling with diminished fortunes in a rapidly changing Japan. His name, Isoroku, meaning 56, reflected his father's age when he was born, a symbolic marker of heritage and generational burden. Growing up in the aftermath of the Meiji Restoration, young Isoroku lived in a society caught between the fading traditions of the Tokugawa shogunate and the fiery push toward modernization. Japan, once sealed off from the world under centuries of Tokugawa isolation, had been thrust open by Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships in the 1850s. By Yamamoto's birth, the nation was reinventing itself at breakneck speed, a feudal system giving way to industrial progress, an island kingdom eager to emulate the naval supremacy of Britain. This was the world that shaped the boy who would one day orchestrate Pearl Harbor. His early education, guided by both Japanese tradition and Western influence, exposed him to English lessons from Christian missionaries, instilling in him a lifelong awareness of foreign ideas. Even though he never converted, this exposure gave him insights that few of his contemporaries possessed. As Japan surged forward, its leaders looked outward, with both admiration and suspicion, measuring themselves against Western powers. To a young Isoroku, this was not just abstract history, it was a lesson in survival. For Japan to endure, it needed to master the tools of modernity, from industry to naval warfare. This understanding would follow him all the way to the bridge of a battleship, as the architect of the most famous surprise attack in modern military history. The late 19th century was a crucible for the Japan that raised Isoroku Takano. When he was still a child, the echoes of the Boshin War, a brutal civil conflict between the emperor's modernizing forces and the loyalists of the Tokugawa shogunate, still haunted his community. The samurai of Nagaoka, his family's own heritage, had fought for the Tokugawa and paid dearly for their defeat. They were stripped of privilege, denied political office, and reduced to watching their once proud warrior tradition dissolve into the new order of the Meiji era. For a boy like Isoroku, this meant growing up in the shadow of loss, but also in the presence of resilience. He was heir not to riches, but to the memory of loyalty, endurance, and sacrifice. These values would shape his view of duty when he donned the naval uniform decades later. In the classroom, Isoroku was curious and hardworking, learning English from a missionary named Mr. Newall. Though the lessons were given in the spirit of Christian evangelism, what the young boy absorbed most was the worldview that Japan was not alone, and that beyond its shores existed powers of staggering strength. His early exposure to Western culture was rare among Japanese youth at the time, and it gave him an almost instinctive appreciation of the foreign powers his nation would one day face. Even his fondness for baseball, a sport imported from America, reflected the growing entanglement between Japan and the West. Yet these cultural borrowings existed alongside a steady indoctrination in national pride, reminding him that Japan must chart its own destiny in a world of predatory empires. By the time Isoroku entered Nagaoka Middle School in 1894, Japan itself was already transforming into a regional power. The Meiji government, inspired by Britain's Royal Navy, was pouring resources into building a modern fleet. British engineers trained Japanese officers, and warships were commissioned from the British shipyards. Japan's leaders had realized a stark truth. If their island nation was to survive in a world dominated by colonial giants, the Navy would be its shield and sword. It was no accident that this belief in sea power took hold just as China, Japan's ancient neighbor, was falling into decline. That very year, the First Sino-Japanese War erupted over control of Korea. In classrooms across the nation, children like Isoroku reenacted battles on school fields, transforming history into sport. For Isoroku, the lessons were sobering. Japan, once a secluded kingdom, now stood victorious over China, seizing Taiwan and asserting itself on the world stage. Yet, as quickly as triumph came, humiliation followed. European powers, Russia, Germany, and France, intervened to strip Japan of its prize in Manchuria. This episode, known as the Triple Intervention, burned into the national psyche a sense of grievance, of being treated as an inferior by the West. It also reinforced the conviction that only military strength could guarantee Japan's survival. For the Takano household, however, there was little time to dwell on geopolitics. As the youngest of 6 boys, Isoroku inherited nothing but expectation. In an era where social mobility was scarce, the Navy became one of the few pathways to honor and advancement. When he sat for the entrance exams to the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1901, he placed second in the nation. At just 17 years old, he embarked on a journey that would take him from the decks of training vessels to the center of global conflict. Already, the shadow of war with Russia loomed on the horizon, and young Isoroku would soon find himself swept into it, not as an observer, but as a combatant destined to be scarred by fire and steel. In 1901, the newly admitted cadet Isoroku Takano stepped onto the island of Etajima in Hiroshima Bay, home of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. There, amid rigorous physical drills and theoretical instruction, he began the life that would define him. He specialized in gunnery, an area requiring precision, discipline, and relentless calculation, traits that would later shape his strategic thinking. Yet, even as he immersed himself in the world of naval warfare, he never abandoned his small reminders of foreign influence. Among his few personal belongings was a Bible, not as a symbol of faith, but as a book of wisdom and curiosity. His classmates eyed him with suspicion. Western ideas, even in written form, were still distrusted, but Isoroku's openness to such influences was a quiet defiance, a hint that his worldview would always differ from the hardline nationalism growing within Japan. His years at the academy coincided with rising tensions between Japan and Russia. The humiliation of the Triple Intervention still burned in the Japanese psyche, and the Tsar's growing presence in Manchuria threatened Japan's ambitions in Korea. Diplomacy faltered, and by early 1904, Japan prepared for war. The naval minister, Admiral Yamamoto, decided to strike first, fearing reinforcements from Europe could tip the balance. The plan was bold: a surprise attack on Port Arthur, a tactic that foreshadowed the methods Isoroku himself would later employ at Pearl Harbor. On February 8, 1904, Japanese warships launched their assault, catching the Russians off guard. For the young cadet Isoroku, still learning the ropes, this was a lesson in the effectiveness and the risks of striking first without warning. Upon graduating in 1904, he was assigned as a gunnery officer aboard the cruiser Nishin. His timing could not have been more fateful. The Russo-Japanese War was raging, and the decisive confrontation came in May 1905 at the Battle of Tsushima. Under Admiral Heihachiro Togo, the Japanese Navy clashed with Russia's Baltic Fleet in one of the most complete naval victories in modern history. But victory came at a personal cost for Isoroku. During the battle, a shell explosion tore into his ship, leaving him gravely wounded. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand and carried a permanent scar on his thigh. Yet, instead of breaking his resolve, the injuries marked him with honor, proof of his courage under fire. Admiral Togo himself praised the young officer's conduct. It was a moment that cemented Isoroku's belief that naval supremacy would be Japan's key to survival in a hostile world. The victory at Tsushima catapulted Japan onto the world stage as a true military power. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European empire in open conflict. The West took notice, and so did the Japanese people. But the war also revealed the precariousness of Japan's position. Despite its victories, the country's resources were stretched thin, forcing Tokyo to accept mediated peace terms under U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan secured Korea and southern Manchuria, but it was denied war reparations, sparking anger at home. Anti-American sentiment grew, and many in Japan saw the United States not as a mediator, but as an obstacle to its rightful place in Asia. For young officers like Isoroku, the lesson was clear. Even in triumph, Japan's survival depended on outpacing the great powers, technologically, militarily, and economically. In the years that followed, Isoroku continued to rise through the ranks, gaining experience not only as a naval officer, but as an observer of geopolitics. When the American Great White Fleet visited Yokohama in 1908, he inspected the massive battleships up close. Their scale and sophistication left a lasting impression. He understood then what few in Japan dared admit openly, that the United States possessed an industrial capacity that Japan could never match in the long run. It was a sobering realization, one that would stay with him for the rest of his career, even as he later planned the very strike intended to cripple that same fleet. The years after the Russo-Japanese War brought both stability and frustration for young Isoroku. Career advancement in the Navy was slow during peacetime, but he was determined to persevere. In 1912, personal tragedy struck when his father, already elderly at the time of Isoroku's birth, passed away. His mother soon grew gravely ill, and for a brief moment he considered resigning his commission to care for her. She, however, reminded him of his duty, not only to family, but to country. Strengthened by her words, he returned to service, carrying with him the weight of filial devotion, entwined with national obligation. By then, at 28 years old, his path as a naval officer was firmly set. By 1913, Yamamoto, as he would later be known, was assigned to the battleship Shintaku, and soon afterward began advanced studies at the Naval War College. He was a brilliant student, absorbing strategy and doctrine, while also indulging his appetite for games of chance. Gambling was more than entertainment for him. It was training for risk and probability, disciplines that would echo in his later war plans. In 1914, as Europe plunged into the First World War, Japan entered the conflict as Britain's ally. Seizing Germany's colonial holdings in the Pacific, Japan expanded its strategic reach into islands like the Marshalls, outposts that would later become crucial in the coming Pacific War. For Yamamoto, these events underscored a truth he had long sensed. Japan's destiny lay across the seas, and naval power would be the instrument of that destiny. By 1916, another turning point arrived. Adopted into the prestigious Yamamoto family of samurai heritage, Isoroku Takano became Isoroku Yamamoto. Adoption was not uncommon in Japan, but for him it meant more than a name change. It was an elevation in status and responsibility. He was now the heir of a lineage that demanded honor and duty above all else. That same year, he was promoted to lieutenant commander, and his trajectory quickened. In 1918, he married Reiko Mihashi, securing the Yamamoto family's continuity. Their union produced children, but the marriage was more pragmatic than affectionate. Yamamoto was bound less by romance than by obligation, and his later relationships with geishas revealed the strains of a man consumed by service and detached from domestic life. Then came America. In 1919, Yamamoto traveled to the United States, where he studied English at Harvard University. It was here that he refined not only his command of the language, but his understanding of American society, industry, and culture. He toured Chicago and Detroit, marveling at the automotive factories and assembly lines. To him, America's true strength was not in its battleships, but in its factories, its limitless production power. Japan could build ships, yes, but could it match the scale of America's industrial machine? Yamamoto doubted it. He studied petroleum resources closely, recognizing that oil, not coal, was the lifeblood of modern navies. Japan, with its limited domestic reserves, would inevitably depend on foreign supplies, a vulnerability that would later drive its desperate expansion into Southeast Asia. Yet Yamamoto was not all business. At Harvard, He indulged in his love of bridge and poker, gambling not recklessly, but with studied calculation. In the smoky rooms of card tables, he read opponents, weighed risks, and sharpened his instinct for bold but measured moves. These experiences, while seemingly trivial, mirrored the strategic gambles he would later make at Midway and Pearl Harbor. More importantly, his years in America cemented a paradox. Yamamoto respected and even admired the United States. He appreciated its openness, its industrious people, and its culture. Yet he also came to believe that if Japan ever went to war with America, it would be a colossal mistake, a battle of attrition that Japan could not win. Returning to Japan in 1921, Yamamoto took up teaching at the Naval War College. He imparted lessons not only on gunnery and tactics, but on aviation and oil, the two pillars he believed would define future warfare. While his students admired his brilliance, few shared his cautious view of the United States. At a time when nationalists within the Navy dreamed of parity with Britain and America, Yamamoto quietly urged restraint. But the tide of militarism in Japan was rising, and soon his warnings would be drowned out by the drums of expansion and war. The 1920s thrust Yamamoto into the center of Japan's evolving naval doctrine. In the aftermath of the First World War, global powers convened at the Washington Naval Conference to rein in the naval arms race. The resulting treaty imposed limits on fleet sizes. Japan would be allowed only 3/5 the tonnage of the British and American navies. For many in the Japanese military, this was a national humiliation. The so-called fleet faction demanded parity, arguing that Japan's honor and security required a navy equal to the West. But Yamamoto, aligning with the treaty faction, accepted the compromise. To him, the treaty was pragmatic. Japan's economy could not sustain unlimited naval expansion, and in his judgment, a war with the United States was not merely dangerous, it was unwinnable. Even then, he foresaw that America's industrial capacity would dwarf Japan's, given time. But if the treaty limited Japan's battleships, it did not restrict innovation. Yamamoto turned his energy toward aviation, convinced that the future of war at sea would be decided not by colossal battleships, but by aircraft carriers. In 1924, he personally trained at the Kasumigora Aviation Corps, even learning to fly despite being in his 40s, an act that drew ridicule from young cadets, until he quickly mastered discipline in the skies. By the end of the year, he was director of studies, advocating for a generation of pilots who would one day become the spearhead of Japan's Navy. He pushed for better navigational equipment and rigorous training, understanding that precision and endurance in the air would decide future battles. His influence helped propel Japan into becoming one of the first nations to commission purpose-built aircraft carriers, with the Hosho launched in 1922, a step ahead of Britain's much-delayed HMS Hermes. His conviction only deepened during his second stint in the United States, this time as naval attaché in Washington in the mid-1920s. While his official role was to ensure American compliance with treaty obligations, Yamamoto kept his eyes fixed on the rapid progress of U.S. aviation and industry. He admired how American pilots employed scientific instruments to guide long-range flights, a field in which Japan lagged. He played poker and bridge with U.S. officers, not just for leisure, but to study their habits, character, and thinking. This blend of observation and immersion gave him rare insight, Americans were not only industrious but adaptable, and any war against them would inevitably become a test of endurance that Japan could not win. The 1929 Wall Street crash and the ensuing Great Depression changed everything. Japan's economy, already fragile, was devastated. Economic despair fanned the flames of militarism. Army hardliners argued that Japan's survival lay in seizing Manchuria's resources, an expansionist move that would place the country on a collision course with Western powers. The assassination of Chinese warlord Zhang Zuolin in 1928 by the Japanese Kwantung Army revealed how aggressive the army had become, often acting without Tokyo's sanction. Yamamoto, who remained deeply skeptical of such reckless adventurism, stood by the treaty faction and argued that Japan could not afford a direct clash with America or Britain. But his influence was waning. The tide of nationalism was rising too quickly, and Japan's leaders began steering the nation toward the dangerous path of continental expansion. Even as politics hardened around him, Yamamoto pressed ahead with aviation. He championed the development of new carrier-based aircraft, encouraging collaborations with companies like Mitsubishi that would eventually produce the legendary Zero fighter. To him, this was not about prestige, but survival. If Japan was forced into a war it could not avoid, aviation was the only chance of balancing the overwhelming industrial superiority of the United States. And so, even as he warned against the coming storm, he sharpened the very weapons that would unleash it. By the early 1930s, Yamamoto found himself standing at the edge of a political and military transformation that he could neither control nor fully resist. In 1931, the Japanese army staged the invasion of Manchuria, defying international treaties and drawing condemnation from the League of Nations. By 1933, Tokyo withdrew from the League altogether, a stark signal that Japan was abandoning cooperation with the global order. For Yamamoto, who had long urged caution and diplomacy, these developments were alarming. He understood that such reckless moves would only provoke confrontation with powers far larger and richer than Japan. Yet, as a naval officer, bound by loyalty and duty, he could do little but prepare for the conflict he increasingly dreaded. In October 1933, Yamamoto took command of the 1st Carrier Division, hoisting his flag aboard the Akagi. His role was not simply administrative. He was responsible for molding a new generation of naval aviators. He encountered brash, undisciplined young pilots, some of whom showed up drunk during exercises. Rather than court-martial them, Yamamoto chose a method both firm and humane. He scolded them fiercely, then asked them to suggest their own punishments. The result was a unit chastened and loyal, a reflection of Yamamoto's ability to discipline without alienating. In these years, he was not only sharpening aviation strategy, but cultivating a leadership style that blended severity with unexpected empathy. Japan's aggressive path, however, only accelerated. In 1932, Prime Minister Tsuyoshi Inukai was assassinated by radical Navy officers, allowing militarists to tighten their grip on the government. In China, Japan deepened its foothold, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo under the last Qing Emperor, Puyi. Yamamoto watched uneasily as his country edged closer to war with both China and the West. Despite his rising rank, he received frequent death threats from nationalist extremists who despised his moderate views and his opposition to a war with the United States. Yet he remained undeterred, often visiting the British Embassy in Tokyo and maintaining ties with Western diplomats, actions that made him even more suspect in the eyes of the hardliners. By the mid-1930s, Yamamoto's international exposure gave him a perspective few in Japan shared. During the London Naval Conference of 1935, he traveled to Britain, where he witnessed firsthand the economic devastation wrought by the Great Depression. Passing through Germany on his way home, he met Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, who sought to draw Japan into an anti-British, anti-American alliance. Yamamoto was skeptical. He mistrusted Germany's ambitions and worried that any alliance would drag Japan into a wider conflict. Back in Japan, however, he was increasingly sidelined as the fleet faction gained dominance. His cautious approach was out of step with a nation enthralled by visions of conquest. Yet, fate offered him another platform. In late 1936, he was appointed Vice Minister of the Navy under his old friend, Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who also opposed reckless expansion. Together, they tried to restrain the Hawks, but their influence was waning as the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1937. Japanese troops advanced into Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, where atrocities like the infamous Nanjing Massacre stained the nation's reputation forever. For Yamamoto, the sinking of the American gunboat USS Panay in 1937 was especially troubling. Though Japan apologized and claimed it was an accident, Yamamoto knew such incidents pushed Tokyo closer to the very war he had long predicted would be disastrous. Still, his sense of duty compelled him forward. Even while disagreeing with the course of his nation, Yamamoto devoted himself to building the Navy into the most formidable force possible. He believed that if war was inevitable, Japan must strike with devastating force at the outset. Yet the irony was unavoidable. The man who most doubted Japan's chances against America was now perfecting the weapons that would bring the two nations into mortal combat. The storm he had long feared was gathering, and soon he would be asked to lead it. By 1939, the path to conflict was almost irreversible, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was thrust into the very center of Japan's destiny. That August, his ally and protector, Admiral Yonai, stepped down as Navy Minister, and Yamamoto was reassigned to sea, not as punishment, but as protection. Extremists in Tokyo had marked him for assassination because of his outspoken warnings against war with the United States. By placing him at sea, away from the political cauldron, Yonai may have saved his life. On August 30th, 1939, Yamamoto assumed command of the combined fleet, Japan's most powerful naval formation. From the deck of the battleship Nagato, he now wielded enormous responsibility. The entire striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But the world was shifting faster than even Yamamoto could maneuver. In Europe, Hitler's armies marched, and Japan soon signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940, binding their fates together. Yamamoto strongly opposed the alliance. He told Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe bluntly that Japan could not hope to defeat the United States in a drawn-out war. At best, he argued, the Navy might dominate the Pacific for a year. After that, American industry, its shipyards, factories, and vast resources would overwhelm Japan. His words were prophetic, but they fell on deaf ears. Nationalists in Tokyo, intoxicated by visions of empire, pressed forward, convinced that America lacked the will to fight. Faced with this reality, Yamamoto turned his focus to planning. If war with the United States could not be avoided, then Japan's only hope was a preemptive strike so crushing that America would lose the will to resist. The move was audacious, even desperate, but Yamamoto was convinced it was the only option left. He looked back to Admiral Togo's surprise attack on Port Arthur in 1904, which had crippled the Russian Pacific Fleet. Could such a strike work against the Americans at Pearl Harbor? To Yamamoto, it was a gamble worth taking, though he knew the risks better than anyone. In 1940, he was promoted to full admiral, giving him both the authority and the responsibility to push forward the plan that would define his legacy. At the heart of his vision was the Kido Butai, the first air fleet, 6 powerful aircraft carriers, operating as a single striking force, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and submarines. It was a radical reorganization of naval doctrine. Traditionally, battleships were the pride of fleets, but Yamamoto placed carriers at the center, turning air power into Japan's spearhead. His insistence on this shift was revolutionary and controversial, but it was also vindicated by the pace of technological change. By 1941, naval warfare had entered a new era, and Yamamoto was determined to make Japan its master. Events outside his control, however, forced his hand. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina to support its army in China, the United States struck back with an oil embargo. For Japan, this was catastrophic. The nation imported nearly 80% of its oil from America, and without fuel, its navy and air force would grind to a halt within months. To Yamamoto, the embargo was the final spark. Japan could either yield to American demands and withdraw from China, an unbearable humiliation to the militarists, or strike swiftly to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. But to do so, Japan would first need to neutralize America's Pacific Fleet, and that meant Pearl Harbor. As 1941 drew to a close, Yamamoto finalized his plans. He knew the risks. He knew America would fight back with an industrial fury, unlike anything Japan could match. But bound by duty to emperor and nation, he pressed forward. His gamble was not for victory. In the long war, he believed that was impossible. Instead, it was to buy time, to deliver such a shocking blow that America might choose negotiation over total war. The stage was set for a strike that would stun the world and forever mark Yamamoto's name in history. The autumn of 1941 was a season of tense anticipation. While diplomats in Washington engaged in the last-ditch negotiations, Yamamoto's carriers prepared in secret for what would become one of the most infamous surprise attacks in modern history. General Hideki Tojo had become prime minister in October, representing the hardline army faction that Yamamoto had so often clashed with. To his surprise, however, Tojo kept him in command of the combined fleet, recognizing that no one else possessed his level of strategic vision. Yamamoto now carried the heavy burden of leading a war plan he had long warned against. His private conviction never wavered. If Japan fought the United States, it was embarking on a path toward destruction. Yet duty bound him, and he set aside his doubts for the sake of the emperor and the empire. In early November, Yamamoto returned briefly to Tokyo to finalize the operational details. the plan was breathtaking in scope. While Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai would launch its carrier strike against Pearl Harbor, simultaneous Japanese offensives would sweep through British Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. It was not simply a raid, it was a coordinated attempt to collapse Western defenses across Asia and secure the oil, rubber, and minerals Japan desperately needed. For Yamamoto, Pearl Harbor was the keystone. If the U.S. Pacific Fleet could be crippled in a single blow, Japan might have 6 months, perhaps a year, to consolidate its new empire before America could recover. On December 2nd, 1941, with negotiations in Washington faltering, Yamamoto issued the order to proceed. That evening, he dined with his family one last time. His words to a close friend were haunting. "Thanks. I don't imagine I'll be back." It was a rare glimpse into his awareness of the storm about to break. Returning to his flagship, Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, he waited anxiously for word as the strike force advanced across the Pacific under a blanket of secrecy. The attack came at dawn on Sunday, December 7th. More than 350 Japanese aircraft roared down on Pearl Harbor, devastating battleships, airfields, and planes in less than 2 hours. Plumes of fire and smoke filled the skies as the Pacific Fleet reeled under the assault. Yamamoto, receiving intercepted American communications aboard his flagship, learned that the strike had achieved its primary objective. 2 battleships sunk, 4 more damaged, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Yet even in this moment of triumph, Yamamoto was unsettled. Admiral Nagumo, fearing further losses, had withdrawn after only 2 attack waves, leaving the vital American repair docks, oil depots, and most crucially, the aircraft carriers untouched. The blow was severe, but not fatal. America's Pacific Fleet, wounded, would rise again. Back in Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress responded with near unanimity, formally declaring war. Yamamoto, though congratulated by his government, was furious at Nagumo's caution. He had wanted total destruction, a knockout that might force America to negotiate. Instead, the survival of the carriers meant the United States still had the capacity to fight back. Yamamoto knew what this meant. The countdown to Japan's eventual defeat had already begun. But for now, his fleet ruled the Pacific, and Japan celebrated its triumph, unaware of the storm that was yet to come. In the weeks that followed, Pearl Harbor, Japan's war machine, surged across Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. Guam fell, Hong Kong surrendered, Manila was abandoned, and British forces in Malaya retreated south toward Singapore. By early 1942, Yamamoto's navy and the Imperial Army had carved out a vast empire stretching from Burma to the Dutch East Indies, seizing the vital oil fields Japan so desperately needed. On the surface, it looked like Yamamoto's gamble had paid off. The Western colonial powers were in retreat, and Japan stood at the peak of its military power. Yet beneath the celebrations, Yamamoto remained uneasy. He knew better than anyone that America's industrial strength was already stirring, and that every Japanese victory only deepened American resolve. To maintain momentum, Yamamoto pushed for new offensives. He was determined to finish what Pearl Harbor had left incomplete: the destruction of America's carriers. Early raids on Darwin in Australia and the Indian Ocean reinforced Japanese dominance, but Yamamoto was frustrated once more by Nagumo's caution. as carriers slipped away time and again. Then came the shock of April 18th, 1942. The Doolittle raid, American bombers, launched from a carrier, struck Tokyo itself. The damage was minor, but the psychological impact was enormous. For Yamamoto, it was proof that the U.S. Navy remained bold and dangerous. He insisted that the only way forward was to draw the American carriers into a decisive battle and destroy them once and for all. The target he chose was Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto's plan was as elaborate as it was risky. He would lure the U.S. fleet into a trap, overwhelm it with superior numbers, and secure Japan's dominance of the Pacific. He even committed his prized battleship, the Yamato, the largest warship ever built, as part of the supporting force. By late May 1942, the invasion fleet was underway. Yamamoto was confident, but he did not know the Americans had broken Japan's naval codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his commanders at Pearl Harbor knew exactly where Yamamoto intended to strike. On June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. At first, events went as planned. Japanese aircraft pounded Midway's defenses, and Nagumo prepared a second wave. But in a fateful decision, he ordered his planes rearmed for a land strike just as U.S. carriers were spotted. The delay proved disastrous. At the very moment, Japanese decks were crowded with refueling aircraft. American dive bombers descended from the skies. In minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were engulfed in flames. By the end of the day, a 4th, Hiryu, was also lost. Over 200 Japanese planes, and many of their most skilled pilots, perished with them. Yamamoto's great gamble had turned into catastrophe. Aboard the Yamato, Yamamoto received the grim reports. His dream of eliminating the U.S. carriers had collapsed in a single afternoon. He ordered a night attack in desperation, but it was too late. By June 7th, Japan's once invincible carrier force was shattered. The loss at Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War. For the first time, the Japanese Navy was on the defensive, and Yamamoto knew the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Japan could replace ships, but not experienced pilots, and America's factories were already building replacements at a pace Japan could never hope to match. The inevitability he had long feared was unfolding before his eyes. The defeat at Midway weighed heavily on Yamamoto, but he did not relent. He reorganized what remained of Japan's naval air arm and turned his attention southward toward the Solomon Islands. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, seizing Henderson Field and threatening Japan's supply lines. For Yamamoto, this was intolerable. The island became the focal point of a brutal, grinding campaign where sea, air, and land battles intertwined in a desperate struggle for control. Determined to retake Guadalcanal, Yamamoto personally oversaw fleet movements from his headquarters at Truk Atoll, throwing wave after wave of reinforcements and ships into the fight. The battles that followed were fierce and costly. In October, Japanese forces mounted repeated assaults, while Yamamoto's carriers clashed with the Americans at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese succeeded in sinking the carrier Hornet and damaging the Enterprise, but at a ruinous price. Hundreds of veteran pilots and aircraft lost. Each victory drained Japan of irreplaceable talent, while America's vast training programs churned out new pilots by the thousands. Yamamoto understood the math of war, and it was against him. For every skilled aviator, Japan lost the U.S. produced three more, and their machines were becoming stronger, faster, and deadlier. By early 1943, the situation had grown dire. Japan's army on Guadalcanal was starving, cut off from reliable supplies. Yamamoto orchestrated a daring evacuation, managing to rescue 13 Austrian men under the cover of night. But the campaign had cost Japan more than soldiers. It shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded its navy since Pearl Harbor. The tide of the Pacific War was turning, and Yamamoto knew it. His private letters revealed a man increasingly burdened, still carrying out his duty, but resigned to the inevitability of Japan's decline. Then came Operation Vengeance. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Yamamoto's flight plans for an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. President Roosevelt personally approved the mission to eliminate him. On the morning of April 18th, Yamamoto boarded his Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, accompanied by a small escort. As his plane descended over Bougainville, American P-38 fighters, lying in wait, swooped in. The Admiral's aircraft was riddled with gunfire and crashed into the jungle. Yamamoto, Japan's most brilliant strategist and most reluctant warmonger, was killed instantly at the age of 59. His death was a severe blow to Japanese morale. At home, the government staged a lavish state funeral, presenting Yamamoto as a national hero and martyr. Yet many within the Navy felt the loss more acutely. Not just the death of their commander, but the silencing of a voice that had long warned against the very war now consuming them. In the years that followed, Japan's Navy would be broken at Leyte Gulf and other battles, confirming Yamamoto's grim prophecy that a conflict with the United States was unwinnable. In the end, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto remains one of history's most paradoxical figures. The reluctant architect of Pearl Harbor, a man who admired America even as he struck it, who foresaw Japan's defeat even as he orchestrated its boldest offensives. Was he a brilliant strategist, undone by political forces beyond his control, or a tragic figure whose genius was spent serving a doomed cause? His story is a reminder that in war, even the most far-sighted commanders are often prisoners of circumstance, carried along by the tides of history they cannot escape.